As Laura Urban rightly said, our stewardship season begins today and continues for the next 6 weeks. Pastor Andrew and I will be preaching on the habits of our faith. We were inspired by the different movements in worship, gathering and listening, proclaiming and responding, celebrating and sending. After spending so much time apart from one another during the pandemic, we wanted to focus on the habits of our faith that we practice together. Because we believe it is in our unity in these practices that we draw closer to God and to one another. We also celebrate World Communion today, an annual practice with churches around the globe, to remind us that God is with us wherever God's people gather to proclaim God's glory and grace. This is why our sanctuary is covered in various representations of our global partnerships. Kamawani in Cuba, Pajutazizi in the Dakotas, San Salvador in El Salvador. We honor and celebrate those relationships today as well. And so in the midst of this celebration of life together, of our church here in Baltimore, and our life together around the world as Christians, it seems fitting that we turn to the book of Hebrews, although that may seem like an odd turn. This letter was written to second-generation Christians in the Roman Empire. And this book captures the spirit of an electrifying faith, one that draws people together across social and political and economic differences, the kinds of differences that marked the lives of believers then and now. For the majority of my short preaching life so far, I have steered away from the book of Hebrews. I admit that I have dismissed it because of its exclusive and graphic explanation of what's happening on the cross. But I hear the words of the author of Hebrews differently after 18 months of pandemic life. I am encountering Jesus in these verses in new ways, and I hope the same may happen for you too this morning. The verse that truly struck me was verse 3, where Jesus is described as the exact imprint of God's very being. This image of Jesus can point us towards how to polish and reflect the image of Christ within ourselves and within one another. There is a Presbyterian pastor named Roger Nishioka who often researches young adults and why they are departing from mainline churches. He says in his research that young adults are looking for a palpable, passionate God, a Jesus that they can feel and touch. And I would argue that the author of Hebrews is looking for that kind of Jesus too. And he wants to draw his readers back into a relationship with a Jesus who they can touch and see and hear. But the gateway to that for this author seems to be through suffering, because it is through the suffering of the human experience that Jesus is made perfect or whole. The paradoxical ways of being human fully on display in Jesus. Jesus embodies the contradictions of human life. Fully human, fully divine, fully suffering, and fully resurrected. All the image of God in human flesh. Jesus is nothing if not this authentic type of God, the author of Hebrews would say. But to the Hellenistic Jews of this era, this description of Jesus might have been scandalous to their ears. God is a mystery with a name so holy no human being may utter it. How could God be a simple person named Yeshua, which is like the name Josh in English? People could never see God because God's presence is too powerful to behold. So how could Jesus be this God that is too powerful to even see? Or to the Hellenistic Greeks and Romans, this description of Jesus would be absolutely absurd. A God who lives the full human experience? A God who feels and suffers, grieves and dies? That would undercut everything they believed in their mythology of the gods. That gods are above the human experience and are the arbiters of power. A God who becomes fully human is not God at all, they might say. But to the author of Hebrews and to this second generation of Christians that the letter addresses, a fully human and fully divine Jesus embodies the contradictions of grace and suffering, embodies a God who loves without conditions. And this is the Jesus that the author points us to see and to feel and to desire a relationship with. And now, the language in Hebrews might be a little extreme, and it would be very easy to think that Jesus is far removed from people and the experience of being human at all. Because the author compares Jesus to heavenly and earthly powers like angels and prophets, just to demonstrate how Jesus relates to them both. Not to create distance between humanity and God, but to show how Jesus connects these two worlds together. That Jesus actually gathers people and the heavens together in one. And that Jesus does this through his life and his death, through his suffering and through his resurrection. And we too can grow in this way. The Jesus way of suffering and grace, the way of resurrection and hope. What makes the Christian life unique is the particular way that God invites us to embrace these paradoxes. We are people of grace and truth, of light and darkness, of day and night, of life and death, of joy and service. And these very paradoxes flow through the being of God into the person of Jesus. And Jesus shows us how to live these contradictions. In this passage, Jesus represents authority and servanthood, power and suffering, glory and humiliation, grace and obedience. In all of these balanced opposites, the God of the universe comes up close and personal to each of us, into our world, into a human body, and into our lives. The letter to the Hebrews was written to a generation of Christians who had never seen or touched Jesus. But they had heard the testimonies of his life and ministry, his power, and his presence. They did not experience the passion or the intimacy of walking with Jesus. They did not have the opportunity to see and hear him teach. And with the pressures they faced in the Roman Empire and the persecution they faced, I imagine that they may have become a little apathetic or afraid. Their spiritual exhaustion and anxiety might sound familiar to us. Many people I speak with are tired of pivoting at work and at home, tired of pandemic living, tired of trying to maintain some normalcy when so much is uncertain. It is almost like a type of spiritual chronic fatigue, out of sync, weary, unable to muster the discipline or the joy that once flowed from our lives. The author of Hebrews serves to show us that there is a way through that. It is through the gathering together into deep and meaningful relationships with God and with one another. A relationship that can remind us that the imprint of God's image is within us and in the people that we meet. One that reminds us that suffering and joy, is God's power within us. Amen.